take the equivalent of 50 million cars worth of pollution off the road by 2020. We then have to combine that with an aggressive cap and trade program that includes an auction, so that we're not simply giving away the rights, the permits to pollute, but we're saying we're going to ratchet down what's permissible each and every year, and we're charging companies for these rights to pollute. They can also trade credits for reductions that exceed the allowable amounts. That will create a marketplace, but it will also generate revenue that we can then invest in the kind of Apollo project that is necessary for us to find the next clean burning energy sources, and we can invest in solar, wind, biomass, and other strategies that are going to be so important.
Don't be hoodwinked. Don't be bamboozled. Don't let them run the okey doke on you. Because while they're trying to distract you with all this stuff, they're robbing you blind.
We no longer talk about building back to what was the circumstance before the storm. Can't do that anymore. We have to build back to a new standard, a much higher standard that anticipates the reality of the repetition of the very kind of superstorm or storm that caused the problem the last time. It's a hell of a lot more costly, but it's also recognition of the need to adapt. This is a deadly serious issue, and we have a deadly serious way to approach it. And that's what we've done since day one in this administration. In the Recovery Act, which I had the happy obligation of being able to administer, it was over $800 billion, and no one who said, I remember, you won't remember, when the President introduced it in the joint session, when he was announcing his budget, he said, and Joe will do it. Remember that commercial, like, Mikey will eat it, Joe will do it, Sheriff Joe, okay? Well, it was destined to be an absolute failure because everybody knew the government can't administer almost $1 trillion program and spend $1 trillion in 18 months and make it work.
I mean, if you challenge climate change, it's almost like they'll put you in prison for challenging the religious dogma of climate change on campus, and that's crazy.
All right.
If we don't stop using fossil fuels,
we're all dead. Sort of guide rails down now. So between the years 2021 and 2030, it's irreversible, the path we've set ourselves on. And one in which is doing away with any subsidies for fossil fuels, number one. Number two, holding them liable for what they have done, particularly in those cases where you're underserved neighborhoods and you know the deal, okay? And by the way, when they don't, when they deliver, put them in jail. That's what I'm not joking.
When I look at what's happening on the other side, I encourage it. I say, no, I think the New Green Deal, or whatever the hell they call it, the Green New Deal, right? Green New Deal. I encourage it. I think it's really something that they should promote. They should work hard on. It's something our country needs. Desperately, they have to go out and get it. But I'll take the other side of that argument only because I'm mandated to. But they should stay with that argument. Never change. Never change. No planes. No energy. When the wind stops blowing, that's the end of your electric. Let's hurry up. Darling? Darling, is the wind blowing today? I'd like to watch television, darling.
Hold on. Please, sir. No, listen. No. We know.
The history of this country grew up on freedom. Freedom to discourse and freedom to debate, that is the foundations of science. And from science you find truth, and from truth you find what the real problems are, and you can solve real solutions. I'd like to know what you think about this, because it says a bill to prohibit the use of funds to establish panel, task force, advisory committee, or other effort to challenge the quote-unquote scientific consensus on climate change for any other purposes. Schumer's trying to pass a bill that we can no longer have discussion, scientific discussion. I think that reminds me of the Council of Trent. This is religion now. It's no longer science.
Millions taking to the streets to protest climate change. And while the majority of protesters were peaceful, that wasn't the case in Portland, Oregon, all thanks to Antifa.
Child, go back. Shut the go back. CHS, you stop-o piece of
You're in the middle of a public park, you pigs. Pig.
I cannot believe they have to take that. How proud their parents must be. Here with more is journalist Andy No, who shot the video. You'll remember he was targeted by Antifa over the summer. Andy, it's clear that a lot of people there were peaceful protests. They got to miss school too. So how many were Antifa?
Yeah, so on Friday, hundreds of thousands around the world marched, and in spite of the apocalyptic language and fear-mongering about the climate, it was peaceful, except for in Portland, where a faction of Antifa militants dressed head to toe in black and wearing masks showed up and commandeered part of the demonstrations. They replaced the chants about the climate to expletives against the police. There were several arrests throughout the day. One of the violent suspects who was arrested, who has a big Antifa tattoo on his neck, was found to be carrying a cache of weapons, including a dagger, a switchblade, a hammer, and brass knuckles. As if that wasn't bad enough, once the climate strike was over, these group of masked militants descended on the local ICE facility, the same facility that was under a 5-week siege last year, and began to throw projectiles like rocks at the federal officers who were protecting the facility. When they responded, they all took off running in different directions, and that's what you see in the video.
Andy,
the police who were chasing them dropped some of the ammunition, and one of the masked Antifa people attempted to pick it up. You can see the abuse that the police endured that day. Antifa says that they organized to oppose the far right, but really they just use that as a pretense to take to the streets, to cycle through a number of issues, and to push their political agenda.
True.
Should the U.S. ban fossil fuel exports, as some other candidates are calling for?
Well, I think we should, in fact, depending on what it is they're exporting for, what they're replacing. Everything is incremental.
By 1930, the promoters of world government had split into two interlocking camps. The Fabian socialists centered in London, and the fascist based in Italy and Germany.
National Socialism will use its own revolution for establishing a new world order. Adolf Hitler.
Supporters of the fascists in the United States and England believed that the military should be used to quickly transform the world into a new world order. While the more sophisticated practitioners of globalism stated that incrementalism was the sure path to world domination.
Well, joining us is Lord Christopher Monckton, and without him, we would definitely have a global carbon tax, what would be the heart of a world government surveillance, control, and taxation system with courts empowered to shut down businesses, you name it. Well, there's been some huge scientific studies that have come out in the last month that have gotten almost no attention. I've seen 4 of them. And Lord Monckton is going to be in D.C. for a critical meeting. He takes off tomorrow. He's going to be there Friday. We're going to be talking to him then. We're going to be getting the latest throughout the weekend. But I really appreciate him coming on to give us an update on the latest, because if it wasn't for Lord Monckton and if it wasn't for some of the other folks that are out there, we would be up the creek without a paddle. And his best website is whatsupwiththat.com. So Lord Christopher Monckton, thank you for helping us not already be in a new dark age.
Well, Alex, it's wonderful to be with you again. And yes, I will be in Washington, D.C. at the Trump International Hotel. I arrive there tomorrow, and I speak there at the lunchtime keynote speech at the 13th Heartland International Climate Conference. And this is a great gathering of the clans, all the gallant climate scientists who have put up with the vilification of the hard left over the years and have continued quietly to do their research. They'll all be there. So if you haven't booked yet, then get onto heartland.org and make sure you make a last-minute booking and get yourself to the Trump International Hotel, Washington, D.C. The conference starts at 8 in the morning on Thursday the 25th and runs all day. And I'll be speaking at lunchtime. I've got the half-hour lunchtime slot. And what I'll be doing, Alex, is explaining to the eminent climate scientists and researchers who are there that a team of 10 scientists led by me, including 3 professors, has identified and can now prove that the climate scientists made a mistake 40 years ago. It was actually a communist at NASA who made the mistake. We've tracked it down who it was and how he did it. And that mistake means that they have multiplied all their mid-range best estimates of how much global warming we might cause by 3. So if you correct for the error, the global warming problem disappears. And in my half-hour talk tomorrow, I'm going to be explaining just enough about what we've found so that any scientist looking at it can go and check with his colleagues and say, are these people right or aren't they? And the answer is going to be, well, we certainly can't rule it out. We think we're very close now to bringing this whole climate scare finally to an unlimited
Well, that's very exciting, but I want to get the 35,000-foot view as well. I also saw articles out of NASA the last year where they went, actually, carbon dioxide is helping plants grow. And actually, the temperature looks like it's actually not just stopped, it's slowing. I mean, I suddenly see NASA basically agreeing with all the mainline scientists.
This is a very interesting development. For some time, NASA satellites have been showing, and you've got the slide up there now, that the Earth is greening. And this is called the net primary productivity of plants, which is a long phrase for the total mass, the total biomass of all the trees and plants on Earth. Notwithstanding all you hear about deforestation and land clearance and so on, there is actually more green stuff, about 15 to 30% more, depending on which research paper you read.
When I used to come to Austin to visit my grandmother, it looked like a desert. It looks like the Brazil now.
Well, this, of course, is the wonderful thing. What is happening is that the CO2 in the atmosphere was too little to be good for plants. And now they're beginning to be able to breathe more easily. And this has 2 effects. You've got some very good illustrations there on the screen. It has 2 effects. The first thing it does is that it fertilizes the plants. CO2 is plant food. You won't hear this from Greenpeace and all the communist extremists, but CO2 is plant food. The carbon in the tree trunks, for instance, doesn't come from the ground. It comes from the CO2 in the air. And there was almost not enough of it there. So the fact that we've now pushed up the concentration of CO2 by about 40% over the last 100 years, plants and trees are absolutely loving this because that's what makes them.
And that's how the Lord works in mysterious ways. Talk about this. They've studied Mars. It probably lost its atmosphere and its oceans because it couldn't hold them in. And we would have gotten in that position. I mean, we're at one of the lowest points of CO2 in history, correct? Until this little bump. This was a godsend.
That's quite right. It had been declining for 4 million years. And had it gone on for another couple of million years, at its present rate of decline, all trees and plants on Earth would have died. We have now, by putting 40% more CO2 back into the atmosphere from which it originally came, and when it was there, the planet didn't fry. Now all the plants are thanking us for that.
And that's key. It was stored it was stored in the crust. We now bring it back up and reboot the planet. That's got to be God.
Well, it is certainly carrying out God's work, let's say. We are restoring what nature had begun to take away, and we're making it possible for life to continue and flourish much more luxuriantly on Earth than it could otherwise have done. And you're quite right. I mean, we just take the Sahara, for instance. As far back as 1981, Nicholson et al., a team of scientists, reported that 300,000 square kilometers of what had been sandy desert desert had been turned green by the extra water vapor in the air, which you get if the air gets a little bit warmer worldwide. This extra water vapor helps the plants. And likewise, when there's more CO2 in the air, the stomata, which are the little mouths on the underside of the leaves, which allow the plants to breathe in the CO2, but they also lose water through those stomata, they don't need so many of them. And the plants are already adapting by growing fewer stomata because there's now more CO2. That means they lose less of the water they do get when it rains. And that means you get a double effect of preserving plants and trees in areas where it was only 40 years ago far too arid for them to survive.
And that's so critical. That means in drought areas, higher CO2, and I've seen the studies, was like some plants can have half as much water, I was reading, as long as CO2's a little bit higher and they don't die.
If we could double the CO2 in the air, drought virtually worldwide would cease to be a problem. It's already declining quite sharply. I mean, the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which measures the overall severity of droughts around the world, hasn't changed in 100 years. But what has changed in the last 40 years is that the area of land under drought has declined. There's less and less drought happening. And the reason for this is the CO2 in the air.
Well, sure, when I said God, I meant God's master plan, Lord Monckton, looking back on this, how carbon is stored, from all of the alluvial things that have been deposited by the plants and animals and life that's died, producing crude oil. We then discover it 150 years ago, pump it up, put it out right at a time that we're starved for this critical, 1/4 of the life cycle on the planet and the carbon cycle, water, what sunlight, carbon dioxide, oxygen. And then now we're terraforming the planet back to a better place. And as you said, it's mainstream news that the Sahara is now being reclaimed by greenage.
That's exactly it. Very large areas of the Sahel, which is the southern Sahara, really dry, one of the poorest places on earth because it was so dry, is now beginning, as it was 7,000 years ago, until about 7,000 years ago when the Nile dried up. That was one of the most luxuriant places on the planet. Now look at it. So we're now putting back the CO2. We're therefore putting back the plants and trees in areas where they never have been before, and they're self-seeding. We're not actually going out into the Sahel and planting them. They're finding their own way there, just as they have countless times before throughout the long and ancient history of this planet. And what people are beginning to realize, that even NASA is beginning to wake up to the fact that if you go on and on and on beating this global warming drum, you're missing the most important half of the story, which is that CO2 is actually good for us, it's good for plants, it's good for all life on Earth, and we want more of it and not less of it. Professor Will Happer at Princeton has been making this point for a couple of decades. He, as you know, is the man who is advising President Trump on climate change strategy, and he is saying to him, you do not need to take any measures whatsoever to restrict the amount of CO2 going into the air. Indeed, not only do you not need to do that, you should not do that, because the extra CO2 is good for everyone.
Well, it's God works in mysterious ways. Stay there, Lord Monckton. I mean, the Earth is starving for CO2. Then we discover giant underground sources and terraform. Well, it's raining, folks, from the UK here. Paul Joseph Watson comes up in the next 2 segments into the 4th hour today. Lord Christopher Monckton's our guest, and he's in D.C. tomorrow giving a speech at Trump Hotel. I wish I could go. I've got family stuff I got to take care of and some things here, but I'd love to fly him down, invite him down to come out to Austin, co-host with us here in the next few days. But just pulling back from this, you're always a scientist. You were Margaret Thatcher's chief advisor on science. Some said her chief advisor total. I mean, you've been around a long time. You're a famous inventor. You're a successful businessman. You parachuted into climate accords in Durban, South Africa when they were censoring you. You've been beaten up in, Paris at climate accords. I mean, the left's really trying to shut you down. But you keep arguing with them about science. Obviously, climate changes. Obviously, things are going on. They want control of all human activity. They want to make industry evil so they can tax and control it. And the world's woken up to this because China, India, nobody else will sign on to it. But what is the current state of their scams? What is the current state of their power grab? Because you can keep stating all these studies, showing all their claims are a fraud. I think the world knows it's a fraud, and we should go after them for the fact that they have developed a fraud and that they're trying to outlaw people questioning them.
Let me pick up on this word fraud, because that, Alex, is exactly what it has become. I mean, what happened when we first submitted our paper explaining this huge error right at the heart of climate science to a leading journal? I won't say which one so as to spare its blushes, and it looks as though the police are going to have to be called in to start investigating some of this. The first thing they did was they said, we can't find anyone competent to review this paper. Well, that was nonsense. So we said, come off it. It's your job to find people competent to review the paper. And if not, we can supply plenty of names on both sides of this debate who would be competent to review this paper. So they gave up on that one. And then they sent it out for review. And after 6 months, they had got precisely 2 reviews, Alex. One of them said this: I do not like the conclusion that this paper comes to. Therefore, I have not read the paper, and I have not read the equations justifying the conclusion.
Incredible.
And that was supposed to be a scientific peer review. The other one said, I have not reviewed the main paper at all. I have read an ancillary paper with an experiment where we had demonstrated how this works by building a test rig. And he said, oh, the experiment wasn't done right. Well, it was, because it was done by one of our national laboratories. So we wrote to the editor and said, look, this isn't good enough. We want to appeal against this. So he said, OK, you can send the paper back to me for review. So we spent another few months trying to see if we could stiffen it up to stop this kind of thing happening. We sent it to him again and got no reply. We sent it to him another time and we got no reply.
Sure, they have that hoax that there's total 100% consensus that we're all going to die. AOC says the Earth's ending in 12 years. It's just insane.
All of this is nonsense. I mean, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she is, of course, a former barkeep and is therefore no expert on the climate or anything else much. And the new slogan, which I understand that the Republicans are adopting, is "Make Alexandria bartend again," because her Green New Deal is heroically absurd. And as you were saying earlier, Alex, this is indeed about concentrating all power over every tiny aspect of every person's life in the hands of the far left. Where did they get this idea? They got it from a particular division of the European far left called the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, the Nazi Party. If you ever read Mein Kampf, which is a deeply unpleasant experience.
That's why he loved IBM, because Hollerith and the machines could track every human activity. The Nazis wanted to do that.
All of that. But the other thing that they wanted to do was to invent an environmental policy. They were the first, and they didn't want to do it because the environment was at risk. After all, it's been around for 4.5 billion years.
No, you're right. Hitler said to control populations, we've got to control the environment.
They wanted to control people, and Hitler actually says so explicitly in Mein Kampf. The idea was then picked up by the Russians. They then began, particularly when the Berlin Wall came down, and they still wanted to influence the West. They began funding the anti-fracking groups in Britain, for instance, because Putin is trying to sell gas from Siberia, which is his only major source of income from overseas. That's what Putin is making his fortune out of. And they want to be able to go on selling gas to the European Union, whose commissars they control effectively.
And Europe is nowhere. We are ridiculous, and we are losing international credibility.
And so on. So there's a lot of things we have to be doing to invest in alternative energy sources, but it's not enough we do it alone. That technology should become a resource we can export. If we had clean coal technology we developed and made the real investment in, we were able to sell it to China. China has all the coal reserves they need.
China is building 1 to 3 new coal-fired plants, burning dirty coal per week. It's polluting not only the atmosphere, but the west coast of the United States.
But I tell you, the tidewater area of your state and my state in 50 years will be underwater if we in fact don't do something about greenhouse gases. It's profound.
Dan, you got the money. Okay.
I got a few, Bob, yeah.
Okay. You support Trump? You do?
Yep.
Okay.
I was one of the first endorsers, public endorsers of President Trump.
What are you guys going to do when our ocean level rises?
Thank you for asking that question. I have the answer.
Don't let me finish.
I have the answer.
Let me finish.
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah. Okay.
For the first time on Earth, we're changing the gas.
Now you're full of shit. Sit down. I'm going to answer you. I'm going to
Fuck you,
just
Dad.
shut up
Fuck
and
you.
shut up and
Fuck
sit
you.
down.
No way.
Sit down.
No, I got to finish my question.
I'm going to answer global warming.
All right, finish the question, then answer.
It's changing on Earth, and it's changing to CO2. What do you people with the money, what are you doing about this? Because
I'm going to tell you right now.
No, I've got children. I've got 21, 23-year-old children. And what's their future with you people with money? You talk about money all of the time.
Okay. Sit down, please. Sit down, please.
What
In
are
the
you
front
doing
row.
about
Excuse me.
Earth?
In the front row. Please
About
sit down.
Earth.
Okay, you've asked your question. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to answer.
Excuse me, ma'am. Will you please sit down?
And
please.
Thank you.
That's okay. Please sit down. Let him answer.
Okay. In 2011, my wife and I were in Antarctica, renewing our vows. For most of you that don't know, Antarctica's on a mountaintop. Okay? And there is a $500 million facility, scientific facility there, and the scientists came to give us presentations about global warming. And they had cores of ice that they had drilled. They had drilled 4,000 or 5,000 cores, and they only brought 15 or 20. So they're going through the second or third core, and they said 275,000 years ago, this was the temperature, blah, 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 blah. And then 55,000 years ago, the world was 2 degrees warmer Celsius than it is today. This is 2011. And stop. And he said, and I said, well, you mean the whole world? He says, yes. And the poles are only benchmarks. And I said, well, what about the things that the young woman alluded to? Okay. And he said, it's all cyclical. And although the gas may have exacerbated it, in the cosmos of time, it's not a fart in the wind. In the cosmos of time, of the 13.8 billion years that we've been on this miserable planet, it's not a fart in the wind. And as I told Joe Rogan on his show, and he said in his infinite wisdom, and Joe, if you hear this, I thank you for the opportunity to be on your show. He said, then in 25,000 years, it's most likely not going to be a problem. Now, my direct answer to your question, if that were really true, which you believe, and let's just for a moment say that it is true. That means that the best scenario vis-a-vis global warming is about 10 feet raise in water. That's the best scenario over the next 40, 50 years. That's the best scenario. The worst scenario is about 100 feet. But let's just take the 10 feet. If the water on the planet is going to rise up 10 feet, that means the southern part of the United States is gone. England is gone. Most of Europe is gone. And I can go, most of Central America is gone. Okay. If that's the case, let's just take Florida, for example, which is one of the fastest growing beachfront condominiums on the planet. In the prospectus, when you invest, there should be, in the footnotes, if global warming is for real, they won't put it that way, global warming happens and water rises 10 feet, this investment you made is fuck all. Not one single investment prospectus written since 2000, this century, has alluded to global warming. Not one motherfucker. If it were really true, the banks wouldn't invest. The banks wouldn't finance. Not one motherfucking condominium. So the people that have the money, and I'm jealous of the Vice President, Gore, which Sally and I rode on a plane from South America with a few years ago. I am jealous he came up with a scam before I did. Because the financial institutions, the banks of this world know it's not going to happen. Otherwise, you couldn't get a goddamn loan in London. You know those 30, 40-year mortgages? The world will be over by then. Is Barclays Bank going to give you a motherfucking loan? With the greatest respect, ma'am, it's the greatest fraud that's been perpetrated on mankind this century.
I don't think that we are discussing climate change the way we need to be discussing
We are in the midst of climate change right now, and it is only going to get worse.
The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change.
The scientists also tell us have 12 years in which to answer that question, 12 years within which to act.
Like, this is the war. This is our World War II.
We have 12 years to turn this around.
We are less than 12 years away from not being able to undo our mistakes.
10 years that we have left to us.
Within the 10 years that we have left to us,
We don't have more than 10 years to get this right.
a little more than 10 years from now.
There is no justice and there is no combating climate change without addressing what has happened to indigenous communities. I speak to you as a human being, a woman whose dreams of motherhood now taste bittersweet because of what I know about our children's future.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
This is about our lives. This is about American lives.
That our community will be uninhabitable, will not sustain human life along this current trajectory.
I am here to say our house is on fire.
It's a crisis that could, at its worst, lead to extinction.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
People are dying.
People are suffering. People are dying. How dare you?
Barack and Michelle Obama, they are buying a house in Martha's Vineyard. I shouldn't say house. This is a massive, incredible beachfront estate.
It is very good to see you again.
Very good to see you.
Thank you so much for stopping by to say hello.
Thank you for having me here.
Of course. Well, you're changing the world, so we're very excited to have you.
And folks, one of the things I'm proudest of is getting passed, getting moved, getting control of the Paris Climate Accord. I'm the guy that came back after meeting with Deng Xiaoping and making the case that I believe China would join if we put pressure on them. We've got almost 200 nations to join.
Okay, Josh, go ahead. Josh.
Mr. President, there was a significant talk at the summit about climate change. I know in the past you've harbored some skepticism of science and climate change. What do you think the world should be doing about climate change, and do you still harbor that skepticism?
I feel that the United States has tremendous wealth. The wealth is under its feet. I've made that wealth come alive. We will soon be exporting. In fact, we're actually doing it now, exporting. But we are now the #1 energy producer in the world, and soon it will be by far, with a couple of pipelines that have not been able to get approved for many, many years. It'll have a huge impact. I was able to get ANWR in Alaska, could be the largest site in the world for oil and gas. I was able to get ANWR approved. Ronald Reagan wasn't able to do it. Nobody was able to do it. They've been trying to do it since before Ronald Reagan. I got it approved. We're the #1 energy producer in the world. Soon it will be by far the #1. It's tremendous wealth. And LNG is being sought after all over Europe and all over the world, and we have more of it than anybody else. And I'm not going to lose that wealth. I'm not going to lose it on dreams, on windmills, which, frankly, aren't working too well. I'm not going to lose it. So, Josh, in a nutshell, I want the cleanest water on earth. I want the cleanest air on earth. And that's what we're doing. And I'm an environmentalist. A lot of people don't understand that. I have done more environmental impact statements probably than anybody that's, I guess I can say definitely, because I've done many, many, many of them, more than anybody that's ever been president or vice president or anything even close to president. And I think I know more about the environment than most people. I want clean air. I want clean water. I want a wealthy country. I want a spectacular country with jobs, with pensions, with so many things. And that's what we're getting. So I want to be very careful. At the same time, you weren't called. At the same time, it's very important to me, we have to maintain this incredible place that we've all built. We've become a much richer country, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing, because that great wealth allows us to take care of people. We can take care of people that we couldn't have taken care of in the past because of the great wealth. We can't let that wealth be taken away. Clean air, clean water. Thank you very much, everybody.
Vice President Biden, I'd like to ask you, 3 consecutive American presidents have enjoyed stints of explosive economic growth due to a boom in oil and natural gas production. As president, would you be willing to sacrifice some of that growth, even knowing potentially that it could displace thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of blue-collar workers in the interest of transitioning to that greener economy?
The answer is yes.
Dude, America first! America first! Get that through your head! Dude, America first! America first! You heard that before? What?
With U.S. companies and researchers leading the way, we are on the threshold of virtually unlimited reserves of energy, including from traditional fuels, LNG, clean coal, next-generation nuclear power, and gas hydrate technologies. At the same time, I'm proud to report the United States is among the cleanest air and drinking water on Earth, and we're going to keep it that way. And we just came out with a report that at this moment, it's the cleanest it's been in the last 40 years. We're committed to conserving the majesty of God's creation and the natural beauty of our world. Today, I'm pleased to announce the United States will join 1 Trillion Trees initiative being launched here at the World Economic Forum. 1 trillion trees. And in doing so, we will continue to show strong leadership in restoring, growing, and better managing our trees and our forests. This is not a time for pessimism. This is a time for optimism. Fear and doubt is not a good thought process, because this is a time for tremendous hope and joy and optimism and action. But to embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse. They are the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers, and I have them, and you have them, and we all have them. And they want to see us do badly, but we don't let that happen. They predicted an overpopulation crisis in the 1960s, mass starvation in the 70s, and an end of oil in the 1990s. These alarmists always demand the same thing: absolute power to dominate, transform, and control every aspect of our lives. We will never let radical socialists destroy our economy, wreck our country, or eradicate our liberty. America will always be the proud, strong, and unyielding bastion of freedom. In America, we understand what the pessimists refuse to see: that a growing and vibrant market economy focused on the future lifts the human spirit and excites creativity strong enough to overcome any challenge by far.